Derek Carter had hauled some ugly cargo in his time. Weapons, stolen tech, illicit substances, you name it. But as he stood in the cargo bay of his ship, staring at the rusted dog cage in front of him, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Guilt. The cage was small. Too small. A thing meant for a mutt, not a sentient being. But inside, curled up as if trying to disappear, was a woman. Not human. Her skin was green. Not the dull olive of some humanoid species, but a deep, rich emerald, faded and marred by bruises. Her long, jet-black hair hung in tangled strands over her face, partially hiding the golden glow of her wide, unblinking eyes. She wasn't crying, wasn't screaming, just staring. At nothing. At everything. As if she were waiting for the world to crush her again. Derek exhaled through his nose. The people who had handed her over didn't call her by a name. They called her cargo. They hadn't bothered with restraints. Why would they? The cage was enough. The thick, rust-orange bars dug into the ship's metal floor, the edges corroded and flaking. It smelled faintly of iron, of sweat, of something wrong. The whole thing felt like a goddamn insult. Not just to her, but to everything. He hadn't asked questions when he took the job. The man who hired him, Corvin, wasn't someone you ask questions. Corvin was a businessman, the kind with blood under his fingernails and a smile that made your skin crawl. He ran an import-export operation, which was just a polite way of saying interstellar trafficking. Derek had worked with guys like him before. Hell, he'd worked for Corvin a few times, but something about this job had fell off from the start. It's fragile cargo. Don't tamper with it. Just deliver it to the buyer on Oris 4, Corvin had said, handing over the contract. No details. No explanations. Just credits. A lot of them. Derek should have walked away. But he didn't. And now here he was, standing in his ship's cargo bay, looking at a living being shoved into a cage meant for an animal. He crouched down, arms resting on his knees. Hey! She flinched. Barely. But he saw it. Derek frowned. She wasn't just afraid of him. She was expecting him to hurt her. His gut twisted. He tapped a knuckle against the metal bars, gentler this time. You got a name? Nothing. No response. No movement. She wasn't just silent. She was trained to be silent. Conditioned. Derek wasn't some bleeding heart hero. He wasn't the kind of guy who went around rescuing people from slavers or starting revolutions. He was a cargo hauler. He moved things from point A to point B, no questions asked. That was the job. That had always been the job. And yet, something in him snapped looking at her like this. She was more than cargo, more than a contract. And if he turned a blind eye, he was no better than the bastards who put her in that cage. Derek inhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. All right, he muttered under his breath. Guess I'm about to do something really, really stupid. He stood up, crossing to the control panel on the side of the cargo hold. His fingers hovered over the release switch. He shouldn't do this. Corvin had connections. Dangerous ones. Breaking a contract with him wasn't just bad business. It was suicide. And yet, none of that mattered. With a click, the lock disengaged. The door swung open an inch. She didn't move. Derek knelt again. I'm not going to hurt you. Still nothing. Derek sighed. Look, I get it. You don't trust me. You probably don't trust anyone. But I'm not handing you over to whoever bought you. That's not happening. You understand? A long silence stretched between them. Then slowly, so slowly he barely noticed, she uncurled her legs, shifting forward just an inch. Her golden eyes flickered up, locking onto his for the first time. There was something there, buried deep beneath the exhaustion, the fear, the years of mistreatment. Something defiant. Derek held out a hand. She hesitated. Then, for the first time, she moved just enough for her fingertips to brush against his. It was a fleeting touch, gone in a heartbeat. But it was real. Derek swallowed hard. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or what the hell he was supposed to do next. All he knew was one thing. She wasn't cargo anymore. She was Saris, and he was getting her the hell out of here. Derek had been in some bad situations before. He'd smuggled contraband through military checkpoints, outrun bounty hunters, and even sweet-talked his way out of a standoff or two. But right now, sitting in the cockpit of his ship with a stolen cargo, hold full of serious problems, He had a sinking feeling that this was going to top the list. Saris, because that's what he was calling her now, sat rigidly in the co-pilot's seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her golden eyes darting across the console like she expected it to explode. She had barely moved since he let her out of that damn cage, her whole body wound tight, as if the universe was just waiting to crush her again. Derek drummed his fingers against the control panel, his mind racing. He had planned to make a clean break, to slip out of the station unnoticed before anyone realized what he'd done. But that plan was already dead, because someone was coming. The ship's sensors blared a warning, and Derek cursed under his breath. Incoming vessels. 3 of them. Not station security, these ships were private. Corvin's men. Shit, Derek muttered, flicking the comms off before they could hail him. All right, sweetheart. Looks like we're skipping the scenic route. Saris didn't react. She was locked inside herself, still and silent, like she'd been trained to disappear even when she had nowhere to hide. Derek exhaled sharply. He didn't have time to fix that right now. The first laser blast rocked the ship. Yeah, I got the message, he snapped, gripping the controls. You want me dead? Get in line. Another shot, closer this time. Shields flared, absorbing the hit, but they wouldn't last long. Derek Carter, a voice crackled over the comm. We know what you took. Power down your ship and surrender. You don't want this fight. Derek gritted his teeth. He knew that voice. Dane Voss, Corvin's second-in-command. A professional killer with the charm of a rabid animal. You see, I feel like I do want this fight, Derek shot back, slamming the throttle forward. The engines roared as the ship lurched ahead, skimming dangerously close to the station's outer hull. Saris sucked in a sharp breath, bracing herself against the seat. The enemy ships gave chase. Derek's pulse pounded. His ship, the Nomad, was fast, but it wasn't built for combat. If he couldn't shake them before they landed a solid hit, they were dead. A new warning flashed across the console. They were locking on. Derek's stomach twisted. Hold on, he said. Then he killed the engines. For a second, everything inside the ship floated, gravity struggling to catch up as the sudden loss of momentum threw them forward. The enemy ship shot past, their weapons firing at empty space. Derek grinned. You dumb bastards always fall for that. He re-engaged the thrusters, swinging the ship in a tight arc. The Nomad dove toward a nearby asteroid field, weaving through jagged rock formations at breakneck speed. Saris made a soft sound. Half a gasp, half a whimper, but she didn't scream. Derek stole a quick glance at her. She was gripping the seat, so hard her knuckles were pale, her golden eyes wide, her breath coming in shallow bursts. But she wasn't panicking. She was watching, like she was calculating the odds of survival. Derek didn't like what that implied. Another blast shook the hull, and Derek swore, jerking the controls hard to the right. All right, sweetheart, if you've got any secret powers that involve vaporizing assholes, now's the time. Nothing. Yeah, figured. The asteroids thinned ahead, opening into the void of deep space. The enemy ships were still on them, but they'd lost the advantage. Time to finish this. Derek flipped a switch, rerouting power to the rear thrusters. The ship lurched, a controlled burst of energy, throwing them forward like a slingshot. The enemy ships scrambled to match speed. Too late. They slammed into an oncoming asteroid, their shields flickering out in a blaze of fire and debris. One down. The second ship veered off course, trying to recover. Derek took the opportunity, flipping the Nomad into a tight spiral before locking onto his target. He wasn't much of a fighter pilot, but he knew how to make a shot count. The ship's cannons hummed to life. One shot, a direct hit to the engine core. The second ship exploded in a flash of blue fire. Derek exhaled, fingers easing off the controls. 2 down. That left 1, but the third ship wasn't firing anymore. Derek checked the sensors. The last enemy ship had pulled back, lingering just beyond firing range. Waiting. Or worse, tracking. That's not good, Derek muttered. Corvin wasn't going to let this go. He'd invested too much in Saris to just lose her. This wasn't over. Not even close. Derek turned to Saris, expecting her to still be frozen in that near catatonic state. But she wasn't. She was staring at him, her expression unreadable. You didn't sell me, she said softly. It was the first thing she'd said since he opened that damn cage. Derek blinked. Yeah, no offense, but I don't do business with assholes who keep people in dog crates." She studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. Just once, like she believed him. Derek felt something loosen in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at getting through this in one piece. But first, they had to disappear. Fast. The nomad floated in the quiet darkness of space, hidden within the swirling rings of a gas giant. Massive chunks of ice and rock drifted past the ship like silent sentinels, their slow rotations catching the faint glow of a distant star. It was the perfect hiding spot, at least for now. Derek had shut down all non-essential systems, reducing their energy signature to almost nothing. If Corvin's men were still tracking them, they'd have to sift through an entire planet's worth of debris to find them. That bought him time. Not much, but enough to figure out what the hell he was going to do next. Leaning back in the pilot's chair, Derek let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. His body was finally coming down from the high of the chase, and the weight of what he'd done was settling in. He had just stolen Corvin's most valuable asset, one that the bastard had clearly invested a lot in. There was no undoing that decision now. He turned his head slightly, eyes flicking towards Saris. She was still in the co-pilot seat, her posture stiff, her hands clenched in her lap like she was afraid to move. She had barely spoken since they'd escaped. Her golden eyes kept darting across the controls, the ceiling, the walls, never at him, always looking for the next danger. Like she thought another cage might drop over her at any second. Derek sighed and pushed himself up. "All right, sweetheart, we need to talk." She didn't react. Or, I could just keep talking to myself," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "But that'd make me look crazy." Still nothing. Derek crossed the small cabin and pulled open a storage panel, grabbing a ration pack. He tossed it onto the table between them. "Not much of a chef, but it won't kill you," he said. "Probably." Saris didn't move. Derek rolled his eyes and sat down across from her, tearing open his own packet and taking a slow, exaggerated bite. The texture was awful, some kind of synthetic protein that tasted like cardboard dipped in sadness. But he chewed anyway, making a point of it. After a long pause, she reached for hers. Her fingers were hesitant at first, as if she expected the food to be taken away. Then, slowly, she peeled back the foil and took a small, cautious bite. Derek smirked. "See? No poison. Just a complete lack of joy." For a few minutes, the only sounds in the cabin were the hum of the ship's life support and the quiet rustling of ration packets. It wasn't much, but it was the first real moment of normalcy since he'd let her out of that damn cage. Then, finally, she spoke. "Why?" Derek glanced up. "Why what?" She was staring at her hands now, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you sell me?" Derek exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "You really think I'd hand you over to those bastards?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet, careful. Everyone else did. Something in Derek's chest tightened. Of course they had. Her own people had sold her. Whoever had captured her had traded her away without a second thought. And now, here she was sitting across from a stranger who, by all logic, should have done the same. No wonder she didn't trust him. Derek set his ration down. "Yeah, well," he said, "I've done some shitty things in my time, but I don't deal in people. That's a line I don't cross." She studied him for a long moment. "You took a risk," she said. "Yeah, well, I make bad decisions," Derek replied, smirking. "It's kind of a theme." She didn't smile. Didn't even seem to register the joke. Derek sighed, dragging a hand through his hair. "Look, Saris." Her eyes snapped to his, wide with surprise. He blinked. "What?" "You called me that before," she murmured. "Saris." Derek shrugged. "Had to call you something. Figured that fit." She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" He hesitated. He wasn't even sure. Maybe it was because she reminded him of something distant, something he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was because calling her cargo or the girl felt wrong. Or maybe he just wanted to give her back something, a name, even if it wasn't the one she was born with. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he just shrugged again. "Dunno. It suits you." Sarah stared at him for another long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then slowly she nodded. For some reason, that small acknowledgement made Derek's chest feel lighter. He exhaled and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. All right, now that we're on first-name terms, you want to tell me what makes you so damn valuable? Sarah hesitated. Then finally she whispered, "My blood." Derek frowned. "Your blood?" She nodded. "It heals." Derek blinked. "Heals? Like, how much?" "A lot," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Injuries, diseases, even things that shouldn't be curable. It regenerates tissue, keeps cells from breaking down." Derek let out a low whistle. Well, hell, now it made sense. Corvin wasn't just selling her as a high-value slave. He was selling the cure for everything. Wars had been fought over less. If word got out that someone like her existed, every corporation, warlord, and government in the galaxy would be hunting her down. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "And I'm guessing your people didn't just give you up, did they?" Sarah shook her head. "They made a deal. With Corvin? With someone else. Corvin was just part of the chain." Her fingers curled into fists. "I was never supposed to go home." Derek's stomach turned. He had met a lot of bastards in his life, but selling one of your own? That was a different level of cold. "Well," he said, forcing a smirk. "Screw them, then." Sarah blinked. "What?" "You heard me," Derek said, stretching his arms behind his head. "They gave you up? That means they don't get a say in what happens to you anymore. Simple as that." She looked at him like she wanted to believe him, like she needed to believe him. Then, hesitantly, she reached forward. Her fingertips barely brushed against his hand before she pulled back again, as if expecting pain, punishment. Derek didn't move, didn't say a word. He just waited. A few seconds passed before she tried again. This time, her touch lingered. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Derek exhaled and gave her hand a brief, reassuring squeeze before pulling back. "All right, sweetheart, get some rest. We'll figure out the rest later." Sarah nodded, but she didn't move away. She just sat there, close enough that he could feel her warmth, close enough that for the first time, she wasn't alone. The Nomad was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of the ship's systems. Outside, the swirling rings of the gas giant shimmered in the distant light, casting shadows across the cockpit. They were still hidden, still safe for now. But Derek knew that safety was temporary. He sat at the edge of his bunk, methodically wrapping a fresh bandage around his ribs. The bruising from their last fight was deep, a mottled mess of black and blue beneath his shirt. He winced as he pulled the fabric back down, flexing his fingers against the dull ache. "You're hurt." The voice was soft, hesitant. Derek looked up to find Saris standing in the doorway of the cabin, her golden eyes locked onto his injury. She had been keeping her distance since their last conversation, retreating back into herself. But now, she was here, and she looked different. Less like a caged creature, more like someone trying to decide whether to step forward or run. Derek exhaled through his nose. "Nothing I haven't dealt with before." She didn't move. "You're lying." He huffed out a dry chuckle. "You picked that up from me? Or are you just naturally good at calling out bullshit?" Sarah hesitated, then took a tentative step forward. "Let me see." Derek raised a brow. "Not sure what you plan on doing, sweetheart. Got a medkit right here." But she didn't stop. Another step, then another, until she was standing right in front of him, so close he could see the faint patterns in her green skin, the way the dim lighting caught the strands of her long black hair. Her gaze flickered to his ribs. Then, slowly, she reached out. Derek tensed, not because he was afraid of her. He wasn't, but because no one touched him like this. Soft, careful, like he was something fragile. Her fingertips ghosted over the edge of his bandages, so light it barely registered as contact. He felt the warmth of her skin through the fabric, a contrast to the sterile cold of the ship around them. Then, before he could process it, a wave of warmth spread beneath her touch. Not just heat, something deeper, something that curled into his bones, smoothing out the pain. Derek sucked in a sharp breath. "Saris, stay still." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but there was something firm in it. Derek clenched his jaw, but obeyed. The warmth grew stronger, radiating outward from where her fingers brushed his side. It wasn't just numbing the pain, it was healing him. He could feel the tissue knitting together beneath her touch, the deep bruising fading. Hell, now he understood why Corvin had been so desperate to get her back. After a long moment, Saris pulled away. There! Derek exhaled, rolling his shoulder experimentally. The pain was gone. Not just dulled, not just patched up, completely erased like it had never been there at all. Well, he said, flexing his fingers. That's a neat trick. Saris stepped back, folding her arms across her chest. It's why they wanted me. Derek's smirk faded. Yeah, he figured. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, she asked, Are we still running? Derek studied her, noting the way she kept her arms around herself, the way she held her chin a little higher than before. She was starting to come back to herself. Whoever that was. We're hiding, he corrected. For now. But I've got a few places we can go. Where? A station on the fringe. Old contact of mine, someone who might be able to help. Saris frowned slightly. You're risking a lot for me. Derek tilted his head. You saying I should have sold you? She flinched, but there was something new in her expression, frustration. That's not what I meant. Then what do you mean? She hesitated, searching for the right words. I mean, I don't understand why you're doing this. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You ever stop to think maybe I don't either? Her golden eyes locked onto his, intense in a way that made his chest feel too tight. You had no reason to help me. But you did. He held her gaze, feeling something shift between them. A tension, thick and unspoken. Then, before he could stop himself, he reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. Saris inhaled sharply, but she didn't move away. His fingers lingered, barely touching her skin, but the moment stretched between them, crackling with something neither of them could define. He should have pulled back, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned in just slightly, just enough to feel her breath against his lips. And then she closed the distance. The kiss was hesitant at first. A question, not a demand. Derek responded before he could think better of it, his hand slipping to the back of her neck, pulling her just a little closer. Her lips were warm, soft, uncertain, but willing. He tasted the hint of rationed food, the faint metallic tang of recycled air, but none of it mattered. For the first time since this whole mess started, nothing else existed. Not the bounty, not Corvin, not the danger that still lurked just beyond the stars. Just her. Just this. Then Saris pulled away, her breathing uneven, her golden eyes searching his face for something she couldn't put into words. Derek swallowed hard. He cleared his throat, trying to remember how words worked. Wasn't part of the plan. Saris exhaled a shaky breath. Neither was you saving me. Fair point. Silence settled between them. But it wasn't the empty, hollow kind it had been before. It was charged, different. Derek ran a hand through his hair, letting out a short, breathless laugh. Well, sweetheart, I think we just made things a lot more complicated. Saris smiled. A real smile. And for the first time, Derek realized maybe complicated wasn't such a bad thing. The nomad moved through the vast emptiness of space, but Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every instinct screamed that something was off, that danger was just outside their reach. Sarah sat across from him in the dim light of the cockpit, absently tracing patterns on the metal table between them. She looked different, not in any obvious way, but the change was there. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living, and that scared the hell out of him, because he knew what happened to things that mattered. They got taken away. Derek exhaled, shaking the thought loose. He had bigger problems to deal with. They were headed to a backwater space station where an old contact of his, Talas Vrin, might be able to wipe their ship's signature from every bounty tracker in the system. If anyone could make them disappear, it was him. But before they got there, Derek needed to make something clear. We need to talk, he said. Saris's golden eyes lifted to meet his. About. Derek leaned forward, bracing his arms against the table. Corvin's not going to stop looking for you. She flinched, just slightly, but she didn't look away. You know that, right? He pressed. I know, she admitted quietly. That means anywhere we go, anywhere we hide, it won't last. He's got money, resources, and a grudge the size of a damn planet. Derek's jaw tightened. He won't just send bounty hunters next time. He'll come himself. Saris nodded. She wasn't naive. She understood the stakes. But then she asked something he hadn't expected. What about you? Derek frowned. What about me? You stole me from him, she said, studying his face like she was searching for cracks. You ruined his deal. I'm not the only one in danger. He forced a smirk. Sweetheart, I've been pissing off dangerous people since before you were in that cage. This is just another day in my shitty life. Saris didn't look convinced. You don't have to do this, Derek. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Yeah, I do. She tilted her head. Why? And there it was, the one question he couldn't answer. Because she was right. He could have sold her. Could have dumped her on some outpost and walked away. Could have made this someone else's problem. But he hadn't. And he wasn't going to. Derek rubbed a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. I don't know, okay? His voice was rougher than he intended. An alarm blared across the cockpit, cutting him off. Derek's blood ran cold. Proximity alert. Saris stiffened. What is it? Derek bolted to the controls, fingers flying across the panel. His stomach twisted as the readings came through. Shit. Saris stepped up beside him, her body tense. What? Derek clenched his jaw. They found us. The tracking ship. The one that had backed off before. It hadn't left. It had been waiting. The comms crackled, and a voice filled the cockpit. Derek Carter. A chill ran down his spine. It was Corvin. His voice was smooth, controlled, like a predator that already knew the kill was his. Let's not make this more difficult than it has to be, Corvin continued. You know how this ends. Derek's grip on the controls tightened. No way in hell was he letting this bastard win. He flipped the comms off and slammed the throttle forward. The Nomad jolted into motion, tearing away from the debris field at full speed. Saris grabbed the edge of the console, her eyes locked on the viewport. Can we outrun them? Derek's lips pressed into a thin line. No. The ship behind them was a Striker class, built for pursuit. It was already closing the gap, its weapons primed. Then what's the plan? Saris asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. Derek's mind raced. He had one advantage. They want you alive, he said. They don't care if I'm breathing or not. Saris's hands clenched into fists. Derek pulled up a map of the sector, scanning for anything they could use. His eyes landed on a small, abandoned mining station drifting near the edge of a nearby asteroid belt. It was risky, but risk was the only thing keeping them alive. Strap in, he ordered. This is going to be rough. Saris didn't hesitate. She dropped into the co-pilot seat, securing herself as Derek veered the ship toward the station. The Nomad shook as a warning shot skimmed past their hull. Corvin wasn't playing around. Derek gritted his teeth. Hang on. The mining station came into view, a crumbling relic from a long-forgotten war. Its docking bay was barely operational, but it was their best shot. Derek pushed the thrusters to their limit. The moment they hit the station's gravity field, he cut the engines completely. The Nomad dropped like a stone. Corvin's ship overshot them, momentarily losing target lock. That was all the time Derek needed. He re-engaged the thrusters at the last second, slamming the ship into the docking bay in a rough, barely controlled landing. The Nomad skidded to a halt, alarms blaring. Derek yanked the release on his harness, spinning towards Saris. Move! She was already unstrapping herself, keeping pace with him as they sprinted for the exit. They barely made it down the gangway before the first explosion rocked the station. Corvin wasn't wasting time. Derek grabbed Saris's hand and pulled her into the shadows of the crumbling corridors. They'll board soon, she whispered. Derek's jaw tightened. I know. Saris turned to him, her expression unreadable. We could run forever, Derek, but we won't win like this. He met her gaze, his chest heaving. Then what do you suggest? A pause. Then, softly, she said, we stop running. Derek stared at her, and he knew. She was right. This had to end, one way or another. The walls of the abandoned mining station trembled under the force of another explosion. dust and debris raining down from the crumbling ceiling. The distant hum of docking clamps engaging sent a chill through Derek's spine. They were here, Corvin's men. Derek pressed his back against the cold metal wall, his pulse steady despite the impending fight. Across from him, Saris crouched low, her golden eyes scanning the shadows, her breathing even. She wasn't the same terrified girl he'd pulled out of that rusted cage. Not anymore. Now, she was ready. Derek exhaled and checked the charge on his blaster. "We don't have much time." Saris nodded. "Then we end this." Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled into fists. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly, but she knew what was at stake. They both did. The Nomad was docked in the bay behind them, their only way out. But the moment they made a run for it, Corvin's men would cut them down. There were too many exits, too many angles of attack. They needed a distraction. Derek's mind raced. There's a secondary reactor room on the east side of this station. If we overload the core, it'll force them to pull back, at least long enough for us to escape. Saris arched a brow. "You want to blow up the station?" "Not all of it," he said with a smirk. "Just enough to make them rethink their priorities." Saris tilted her head, considering. "That could work." Derek looked at her. "You sure you're up for this?" A flicker of something crossed her face. Determination, resolve. "I'm done running, Derek." That was all he needed to hear. He tightened his grip on his blaster. "Let's move." They crept through the station's dark corridors, sticking to the shadows. The flickering emergency lights cast eerie patterns against the walls, the remnants of a long-forgotten conflict still etched into the steel. Derek knew these kinds of places. Forgotten outposts, graveyards of the past. It was fitting in a way, because tonight this would be the place where either Corvin died, or they did. Saris moved beside him, silent as a ghost. They reached the reactor room without incident, but the moment Derek keyed in the override sequence, the station's failing power grid roared to life. The noise was deafening, and it gave away their position. Derek muttered a curse and spun toward the hallway just as the first wave of mercenaries arrived. Blaster fire erupted. Derek shoved Saris behind cover, rolling into position and returning fire. The first merc went down, but more were coming. A lot more. Saris grabbed his arm. "We have to go now." The reactor's warning alarms blared. The core was destabilizing faster than Derek had planned. "That's our cue," he growled, grabbing Saris's hand and pulling her toward the exit. They sprinted down the corridor, the walls shaking around them as the reactor's energy output spiraled out of control. The mercenaries were still behind them, but they weren't shooting anymore. They were running. Even they knew what was coming. By the time Derek and Saris reached the docking bay, the station was already tearing itself apart. Sparks rained from ruptured conduits, fire licking at the edges of the failing structure. The Nomad stood waiting, the boarding ramp down, but standing between them and freedom was Corvin himself. The bastard didn't even look worried. "You made a mistake, Carter," Corvin said smoothly, his sharp, predatory gaze locked onto them. "You think you can take what's mine and walk away?" Saris tensed beside him, her entire body going rigid. Derek kept his blaster steady. "She was never yours to begin with." Corvin smiled. "That's where you're wrong. Do you have any idea what she's worth?" Saris lifted her chin. "I'm not for sale." Corvin's smile widened. "Oh, but you were. Your own people made sure of that." Something dark flickered across Saris's face, but she didn't back down. Derek tightened his grip on the blaster. "Let her go, Corvin. Walk away." Corvin tilted his head, considering. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, his men raised their weapons. Derek fired first. Chaos exploded in the docking bay. Blaster fire scorched the air as Derek grabbed Saris and pulled her toward the ship. The mercenaries opened fire, but the station's failing structure was working against them. Chunks of debris rained from the ceiling, sending men scrambling for cover. Corvin wasn't running. He was coming for them. Derek barely made it up the ramp before Corvin grabbed his shoulder, yanking him back. They crashed against the metal floor, rolling into a brutal fight. Corvin was stronger, but Derek was angrier. A solid punch to the ribs sent Corvin stumbling, but he recovered fast, lunging again. Derek barely dodged the next blow, slamming his elbow into Corvin's throat. The man choked, staggered, but before Derek could finish it, Corvin pulled a blade. Derek saw the flash of steel too late. The knife drove forward and stopped inches from his chest. Sarah stood behind Corvin, her hand wrapped around his wrist, holding him back with impossible strength. Corvin's eyes widened in shock. Sarah's voice was calm, steady, unshaken. You don't get to own people anymore. Then, with one swift motion, she twisted his wrist, snapping the bone. Corvin screamed. The knife clattered to the floor. Derek didn't hesitate. One shot, right between the eyes. Corvin collapsed, lifeless. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The station trembled violently, its final moments approaching fast. Derek exhaled, chest heaving. We need to go. Saris nodded. They ran up the ramp, sealing the hatch behind them. The moment Derek reached the cockpit, he punched the engines to full power. The Nomad roared to life, launching from the bay just as the entire station imploded in a burst of fire and metal. The force sent a shockwave rippling through space, but they were already clear, already moving forward, already free. The silence in the cockpit was thick, but it wasn't heavy. It was relief. Derek let out a breath and leaned back in his chair. Well, sweetheart, I think we just made the universe a little more interesting. Sarah sat beside him, watching the stars streak past. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, quietly, she said, I never thanked you. Derek glanced at her. For what? For saving me. Derek huffed a soft laugh. I think we saved each other. Saris turned to him, studying him with those golden eyes. Then, before he could react, she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't hesitant this time. It was real, warm, certain. When she pulled away, Derek let out a breathless chuckle. Guess that settles it, huh? Sarah smirked. Guess so. The vastness of space stretched before them, infinite and untamed. The Nomad drifted through the quiet, the hum of its engines steady, unhurried. No alarms, no threats on their tail, just peace, a rare thing in Derek's line of work. He sat in the pilot's chair, hands resting lazily on the controls, though he wasn't really paying attention to their course. Didn't need to. There was nowhere they had to be, no one they had to outrun. Not anymore. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Derek Carter was free. And so was she. Sarah stood near the viewport, bathed in the soft glow of passing stars. Her long black hair cascaded over her shoulders, her green skin illuminated by the gentle light of hyperspace. She had changed in the days since they left the wreckage of Corvin Station. Or maybe she was simply becoming who she was always meant to be. Derek watched her quietly, resisting the urge to say something flippant, to break the moment with a joke like he always did. But this time words felt unnecessary. Then, without turning, she spoke. You never asked my real name. Derek blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Figured you'd tell me when you were ready. She exhaled softly, placing a hand against the glass. Saris, she murmured. It was never my name. Derek leaned forward, watching her carefully. Then what is it? For a moment, she hesitated, as if saying it aloud would make her vulnerable again. But she wasn't in a cage anymore. She wasn't someone else's possession. She was herself. Leora, she said finally. The name hung between them, delicate but strong. Derek rolled it over in his mind. Leora. It suited her. Why didn't you tell me before? He asked, his voice softer now. She turned to face him, golden eyes filled with something deep and unreadable. Because I wasn't sure I still belonged to it. Derek frowned. You do. Her gaze searched his. You were the first person to call me something that wasn't a price tag. He ran a hand over his jaw. Yeah, well, you deserved better than a name someone else gave you. Leora smiled, a real, genuine smile. Not the small, hesitant ones from before, but something unburdened. I like Saris, she admitted. It meant something, but I don't want to forget who I was before all of this. Derek studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Leora, it is. Something warm flickered across her face, and before he could react, she closed the distance between them. Her hands slid to the sides of his face, her fingers threading into his hair, and she kissed him. Not tentative, not hesitant. This time, there was no question. Derek responded instantly, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her against him. There was no urgency like before, no desperation fueled by the chaos of battle. This was something else, something real. When she finally pulled away, her forehead rested lightly against his, her breath mingling with his own. Derek smirked. So, Leora, huh? She laughed softly. You like it? He ran a hand down her back, his voice low. I like you. Leora's expression softened, and for the first time since they met, she didn't look like someone waiting for the universe to take something away from her. She looked like someone who had chosen to stay. Derek let out a slow breath, rubbing his thumb along the curve of her jaw. So, what now? Leora glanced at the stars beyond. We keep going. Derek smirked. Anywhere in particular, or just wherever trouble finds us? Leora's eyes glowed with something mischievous. Both. He chuckled, shaking his head. You really are trouble, aren't you? She kissed him again, shorter this time, but just as meaningful. And you love it. Derek grinned. Yes, sweetheart. I really do. As the nomads sailed deeper into the unknown, Derek Carter and Leora. Not cargo, not a stolen prize, but a woman finally free, set a course toward whatever future they decided to make. Together. And for the first time in both their lives, they had won.